Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're really excited for this conversation that we're going to have regarding risk-based monitoring. So we want everybody to have great conversation. We want this to be a very interactive, informal session, so please feel free to ask questions as they come up. We're going to get started, and I'm going to let Dr. Murphy introduce himself and the rest of the panelists, and then we will have our presentation followed by dinner.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. You know, when we scheduled this, we had no idea we'd be competing with the presidential candidate debate, which is also going on this evening. But you know, what an exciting time it is to be in research and development, right? So many innovative products, so many interesting diseases. We thought a topic such as this one, which is not only timely, but also one that's very important to discuss. So we set up a mock debate with a point of view that's very strongly in favor of doing it every time, a counterpoint which has more of a grounded approach, and a voice of reason, as I say with Lisa. It's as if we're trying, you know, you have one eye on heaven and one foot firmly in the ground, and somewhere along the way there's a rapprochement between the two. So my name is Mike Murphy. I'm Chief Medical and Scientific Officer for the company, and I'll be taking the point, that is the advocacy for doing this virtually always. And Tom, if you would.
My name is Tom Wardle. I'm the Global Head of Operations for Worldwide Clinical Trials. My mother would say this fits me really well to take the counterpoint to the contrarian side of things. So hopefully we'll have some fun with that.
And I'm Lisa Dickard, Clinical Operations Manager with the company. Actually, I'm the reason. I'm kind of the balance between these two.
Thank you so much. So should risk-based monitoring be considered in every program? Well, you can tell by my particular background, I am very clinically focused. I'm with the site, I'm with the patient, I live with the medical care of these individuals, and I am going to take the point of view, which I think I can adequately defend, that it should always be a default consideration in every clinical trial. Now, because it isn't about efficiency, it isn't about just saving money, although we can speak to that in some detail. It's about quality, and it's about returning to using risk-based monitoring and returning to a very patient-centered clinical research model, which we once had, actually, but somewhere along the way may have lost. So my point of view is quite strong this way, and so we begin, as it usually does, as terms and parameters. The only thing that could be more confusing than this topic in terms of nomenclature are for those of you that work in adaptive trial design, similar discussion. You know, I don't think we keep using the word. I don't think it means what we all think it means. So we start, is it central monitoring? Is it remote source data verification? Reduce SDV, remote monitoring? Is it dynamic monitoring? Is it triggered monitoring? It's certainly data-driven. The only seminal point you come to when you look at the literature is that it is in evolution, it is rapidly changing, it is awash with opinion. Awash with opinion, but sometimes not so much data. What data we do have, though, is really quite remarkable. And but we're going to show, so in general, for our discussion, when we say risk-based monitoring, we mean there is an element of field monitoring, there's an element of remote monitoring, centralized monitoring, and then a kind of an algorithmic centralized risk detection process. You'll hear us speak to issues such as predefined key risk indications and thresholds, central monitoring systems that are needed to make this thing sing. You'll definitely hear us talk about building it into the protocol, right? If you don't pack it in the suitcase when you get on the train, it won't be there when you get off. So building it into the protocol is key. The method of escalating issues when they occur, what triggers an on-site visit, and the objective for all of us actually, is it'll target the effort on relevant areas, maximizing efficiency, and I will also argue maximizing the qualitative aspects of doing this well. So great articles out there. There are a few. This is one by Briggs Morrison in the clinical transformation unit. So significant, so we asked the question, what are people doing? Significant variation in monitoring practices exists across a wide range of clinical trial sponsors. Heterogeneity in practices even exists within operational units as well. Oncology isn't always CNS, isn't always dermatology, even in some companies. So we begin with the challenge of having no set grounding across the business. Another one, a lack of published empirical data comparing monitoring strategies. Everyone has a passion about monitoring in this fashion or another, but very few people actually have data, comparative data, that will contrast the benefit and the disadvantages of one versus the other. The only two studies I'm aware of that in a prospective fashion are evaluating the utility of risk-adapted on-site monitoring with intensive monitoring strategies or near closure will not be published, I can confirm, until 2016. So we'll take a look at what that looks like. Seminal article here by Sheets et al. In 2014. I put the conclusion here. When traditional SDV has occurred, has been examined, error detection reflects mostly inaccuracy in transcriptions, adding little value as a primary quality management system. Isn't that profound? Yes. What we're doing adds very little substantive value to the ability to deduce efficacy and safety from a trial. Or better, this is a beautiful article here by the Transcelerate team with limited data. Now one can stratify this discussion by level of risk, by therapeutic area, by phase of research, by certain critical indicators, and certainly size does matter. So that's what the literature would say. Look at one piece of data from Sheets, is very impressive. Most impressive, and this is what we're looking at here, the percentages of electronic case report form corrections attributed to an SDV versus other methods. The most amazing statistic is the one that's the elephant in the room. 96.3% of the data require no correction. SDV doesn't add to the bulk of the information that we need. In fact, they have to pull this little thing out on the SDV here is accounting, this is across over 1,000 studies, over 50 different sponsors. SDV is accounting for roughly 1.1% of the errors that we detect. And if we restrict the review only to critical values, it's 0.6% of the data is actually considered critical. Well, if we're not doing it to detect errors, what should we be doing it for? I submit to you in this nice review by Macefield, it's about clarification of protocols. It is about best practice sharing. It's about staff education, communication among study staff. Those are laudable, wonderful things to do at an SDV, rather than simply checking data, which apparently does not yield material benefit. Now, there are disadvantages. Everyone knows the cost, staff time to the site, which Lisa would certainly speak to. There's even one neat article, it's an old one, and I hope it's no longer true, from the Oncology Cooperative Group that says it's quite annoying. So there's that as well, okay? But nevertheless, the seminal point here, it's not doing what we thought it should be doing, and therefore perhaps the time for change. So if you look back, the original title we had for this talk was like Risk-Based Monitoring, the Flux Capacitor of Clinical Research, right? Back to the Future, the flux capacitor. So I had to put Game of Thrones in here. Basically, we're talking about in the 80s, we're playing checkers, right? Those of you that were around the 80s might remember that. It was a very slow game. It was very physician-centric. There was incremental innovation with rare big leaps. It was very transactional, very predictable. But here's the one thing that at least I remember, it was intimate with the data. The monitors that we had on the pharma side of the business, they could tell you who the patient dated at their senior prom. They knew the patients, they knew the sites, they were managing sites, they were not just checking data. Well, the 90s came along and everyone needed to play poker, right? Bold plays, big blockbuster programs, the mega trials, right? 15,000 patients in 2,000 centers and so forth. And the industry developed remarkable technology, right? System scale, infrastructure process. This was the heyday of working through these solutions. And indeed, they were very remarkable evolutionary trends in the business. But nevertheless, for some reason, monitors still check data. In fact, my opinion is they were wrapped in a cocoon of technology. Rather than enabling what they did from a clinical point of view, they became encumbered with the systems we had in place to do these studies well. And in the last decade, for sure, we're playing lots of chess out there. It's anticipatory, it's quite strategic, it's very, very deep science with target segmentation. Every disease now seems orphanized, at least from my point of view. Technology now is in service to the monitoring. It's not encumbering the monitor, it's releasing the monitors from the constraints that they've had. Monitors are again managing sites, and they in some respects truly are becoming extensions of the sponsor. So it's a very simple message here. Very simple message from my point of view. It's in a high science, innovative research and development environment. Playing chess and not poker is strategic. Using the resources of the CRO to exploit the professionalism of the staff that go out to visit these centers is timely and highly desirable. Competency and integration across partners who offer technology as a substrate to study conduct and not as a substitution for study conduct, as a substrate for doing the work. Risk-based monitoring, or you'll hear about many hybrids that exist today, is a default. Until proven otherwise, it's always a part of the discussion. Now, it can be proven to be otherwise, but the initial discussion always has it on the tray. And the bottom line, at least from my point of view, before Tom will take us down the more pragmatic path, incentivize what matters. If we're going to pay someone to travel to New Orleans, now as a native of New Orleans, just the thought of that provides much pleasure, right? But if we're going to do that, let's make the visit count. Let's move the monitors out of the storage area where we review source documents and put them into the conference room, where they can talk more about protocols and patients and enabling the research that you've invested so much money in. In short, let the monitors become a professional extension of your staff. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tom, who will bring us back down to earth.
That's the advance right there. Very good. Thank you, Mike. So my contrarian approach is a little provocative when I say that that risk-based monitoring has been inappropriately recommended and enthusiastically endorsed without critical consideration. Let me provide a little bit of a disclaimer here. Risk-based monitoring is here to stay in all of its iterations. It's been around for a few years now. If you go online and you Google risk-based monitoring, you can get tons of literature back. Some of it's very good literature too. Transcelerate has it. A lot of pharmaceutical industry papers are published from industry and so forth. So again, my disclaimer is it's here to stay. What I'd like to focus on are really a few key questions that will help you think more carefully, more pragmatically about what needs to be in place before you embark on a risk-based monitoring approach. Okay? Straight from the FDA paper on risk-based monitoring, a little bit collapsed here, but the FDA is certainly, as we all know, encouraging risk-based monitoring. And I emphasize two key components that I want to talk about here, a couple other points here about what must be in place. So you've got a broad endorsement from FDA and from other agencies in Europe, EMEA, so forth, to undertake risk-based monitoring. But they very specifically point out in the early part of this guidance document that it's based upon the appropriate use of centralized monitoring and reliance on technological advances. So those are the two key points that I want to touch on for just a moment here. Okay? I'm going to kind of put this in the context of four critical considerations. First, I think it's important to understand who's recommending it, who's endorsing it, why are they doing it, why is it being pushed, okay? And there are some reasons we'll talk about in a moment. Are the personnel and processes in place to really undertake a centralized monitoring approach? Most organizations have in-house CRAs. What an in-house CRA does is not the same thing as an effective centralized monitoring operation. Third is, are the technology capabilities in place? show you a couple of diagrams here that might help put a little bit more context around what I mean by that in just a moment. And fourth, our sponsor, CROs, and I probably should mention as well, although maybe not to the same degree, sites. So our sponsor, CROs, and sites aligned and willing to stay the course when things get a little shaky in a program or a protocol or a project that you're running. Things always get a little shaky. There are always things that go wrong in a clinical trial, regulatory delays, timelines, things like that. Ethics committees coming back saying, no, we want more scrutiny on this parameter or that parameter. So our CRO sponsor is going to remain aligned when things start to get a little shaky, or will they jump ship and revert back to what people know best, which is traditional monitoring? So let's touch on this concept of who's recommending it and why are they doing it. First, there is a significant rising prevalence of risk-based monitoring in the industry. A recent survey that was conducted by the Metrics Champion Consortium across a broad number of pharmaceutical companies and CROs, their data suggests that 50% of these organizations are actively employing some type of risk-based monitoring program. Now, here's where it gets a little fuzzy. The majority of these programs involve on-site monitoring with reduced SDV, as well as some type of central data analytics. That's a very broad description of what risk-based monitoring is. And what I'd like to point out as we go through this in a little bit more detail is, what does that really mean? What things do you have to have in place to be successful in doing that? Where's the push coming from? There's obviously the quality and the cost argument. And most people rationally will say, well, it's both. It should be quality and cost. But as you can see on my scale, I tip it a little bit towards cost because I think that's what most people gravitate to. And very generally speaking, I would say that when you look at outsourcing personnel and senior management, they're grasping onto risk-based monitoring because they believe it will be a cost-reducing and efficiency improvement that will significantly reduce the cost of clinical trials. Examples of that would be in expense management, pass-through costs, reduced travel time, reduced on-site time, the cost of moving people around at regular intervals to see the sites. Also, potentially site burden. We see in our business sites, adding surcharges for not just the actual patient activities, but the amount of time that they have to spend managing on-site monitoring activities. Okay? So there's a real potential reduction there. Very generally speaking, I would also say that, on the clinical side, there's a push for, as Mike has talked about, the improvement in quality, focusing on the things that are most important. What's the patient quality? Is there rapid access and analytical capacity and proactivity that's gained from that in risk-based monitoring? And then the ability to focus on the right clinical data at the right time. So you've got this balance going on. I would argue that the push for it balances a little towards the cost side of the equation right now, that we haven't really fully benefited as an industry from the quality aspects that we can get from risk-based monitoring. And I'd underscore that with this powerful financial incentive that you get when you consider monitoring in the context of an entire clinical trial. The services that have to be rendered, the investigator grants, all of the pass-through costs, you're looking at 30%. We're talking billions of dollars on a year-to-year basis of monitoring that goes on. I know certainly in the services that we provide, if you just look at clinical services, we average about 45 to 50% of our service fees are related to monitoring. On a $10 million program, that's a significant reduction in dollar amounts. So that's really, I think, where the push is coming from on who's recommending it and why they're doing so. Now, centralized monitoring. I mentioned a moment ago that having a workforce of in-house CRAs is not the same thing as centralized monitoring. There are many elements that have to come together to really put together an effective centralized monitoring function. Again, I define it as the remote evaluation of clinical data. You've got a lot of people that would be involved in doing a truly well-organized centralized monitoring activity. Project managers who are responsible for developing the program in conjunction with these other functions out there, and being able to amend that program and communicate those changes with all of the internal players here as well as a sponsor. So speaking from a CRO point of view, They have to keep the train on the track, so to speak, when that train is changing directions periodically based on what you learn from that data aggregation. Likewise, you've got the clinical monitors, the CRAs. What's their location? So as I kind of roll through these very briefly here, think about that when you're evaluating the implementation of a risk-based monitoring program. If you're in outsourcing and you're evaluating an organization, a CRO, for example, you need to think about and ask some really hard questions on, well, what's the differentiating role that a monitor would play? What's the differentiating role that a data manager would play? Do they have better, quicker access to the data than they would in a normal program? What is their site communication? How does that change in a risk-based monitoring program? What's the internal communication? What's the technology platform that they're operating with to be able to enable them to look at the data in an aggregated format? Statisticians, they obviously play an important role both in protocol design, but certainly in programming, the analysis of the data that's specific to a particular program, for example. Medical monitors, they may be looking at this completely differently, inclusion-exclusion criteria, safety parameters. Again, the specific question you would want to understand is, how does their role differentiate in a risk-based monitoring program compared to one that's not using that? And then last but not least, the sponsor. From our perspective again, how are we keeping the sponsor informed about what's changing as we look at centralized monitoring and the data that we get and aggregate from that, and keeping them comfortable with what we're doing and what we're reviewing along the way. Now, even if you're not working with a CRO, these are similar questions that you would want to look at in a pharmaceutical company in terms of, how do I put together a program that utilizes all of these clinical expertise, these functions within an organization that are going to help you put together the right type of program for centralized monitoring. So it's much more significant than just an in-house monitoring workforce. Now let's look at the technology. As you're evaluating whether or not you have the capabilities in place to look at this, you've got to look at the technology stack. And I take a diagram here from a technology consideration paper that was written by Transcelerate and then published in a DIA journal. And what you've got here very briefly here is a building block, as I call it. Most sponsors and CROs have these basic technologies. They're common to most organizations. Electronic data capture is common now. We've almost completely eliminated paper CRFs. Electronic informed consent, aggregation of laboratory data. In other words, this block down here is the clinical aggregation of data. On the right side, what you see here are the technologies that are required to operationalize a program. IVRS, CTMS system, grant payments, electronic trial master files, etc. Okay? So you've got clinical, you've got operational. And again, most organizations are very competent in these types of technologies and activities. Where it gets a little dicier is how well are they integrated. And again, most organizations are able to integrate information across operations and clinical technologies pretty well. Gets a little dicier as you work up the pyramid here on being able to really aggregate the data efficiently. And the key differentiator really comes into the analysis and the intervention, the analytics of all that data. Are you able to look at trend lines, box plots, funnel plots? Are you able to look at data in a way that will enable you to understand signals that you have predetermined as you get into this type of a program? So there really is a kind of a pyramid that's built here based on the technology, the ability to aggregate it, integrate it, but most importantly, the ability to analyze it. So as you think about putting together an RBM type of program, you really have to consider, again, the people and the processes that they have to look at this, as well as the technology stack that you're using, and not just their basic elements, but how that information is utilized across these different domains of clinical and operational data. Okay. Now the fun part, the pragmatic part. Are sponsor CROs and the sites willing to stay the course when things get a little bit fun, when things start to not go as well as they should go? And it's easy to say, old habits die hard. People who have been in the industry for a long time are going to start to revert back to things that they know best when you start to see problems at a particular investigator site, when something is missed in a monitoring visit. You know, inclusion-exclusion criteria is messed up and the physician didn't catch it and maybe a monitoring visit missed it or something like that. And there's a natural tendency to say, wait a second, we missed it once. Does that mean it's been missed 50 other times? And let's abandon you know, a limited source document or a limited number of monitoring visits and throw the doors back open and say, let's go monitor everything again. Okay? That's just one simple example, but it happens sometimes. So you have to be committed to a well-organized, you know, program and be able to stay with it. So a well-designed and executed RBM, you know, shouldn't be abandoned. You need to stay the course with it. Things that can come up along the way, obviously, are protocol deviations, as I mentioned a moment ago. What happens when patient accrual? We see this, it's a good problem to have most of the time, when patient accrual happens much faster than you think it's going to happen. Can you still aggregate the data, get the sites to accrue that data into an electronic database, integrate laboratory data with it quickly and efficiently to be able to, you know, have some real-time review of that information and then be able to react to it when patients are accruing into a study very quickly. So I'm sure some of you have seen that. What happens when the patient accrual is very slow? How do you analyze restrictive inclusion-exclusion criteria? Are you doing a data-driven analysis of screen failures? That would be information that might cause you, again, to change your approach to a RBM type of strategy. Occasionally, we get regulatory and ethics committee oversight. They'll throw in additional requirements periodically that you maybe didn't anticipate when you wrote the protocol. We often run into this problem where, you know, a regulatory body in Europe will look at a protocol and say, our standard of care is a little bit different. We think you should change the protocol. And now you've got to go back and revisit what your strategy would be for risk-based monitoring. Unexpected safety events can throw a wrench into the works as well. Okay? So why is there a tendency to revert to traditional on-site monitoring beyond just the fact that old habits die hard sometimes? Well, the mandate, and this is in the guidance document for risk-based monitoring, is still very strong from FDA. Okay? You as a sponsor, delegated to a CRO sometimes, still have this mandate to determine and assure the quality of the overall conduct of the trial at the site, the clinical investigator's attention to detail, the thoroughness of study documentation, are they appropriately delegating tasks, appropriate investigator supervision of staff performing the critical study assessment. There's still a very strong mandate that we can say yes to all of those categories there, which pushes you back away from risk-based monitoring again in favor of we need people on site at a regular interval to be able to assess these types of activities. Okay. Further, has there been adequate training of the sites? When you run into problems with clinical investigators, the natural tendency is let's go out there, spend more time at the site, make sure they're trained. We'd like to think that all happens very well at the investigator meeting at the very beginning of the trial, but the reality is some sites need more training and it requires them to go back on site, you know, monitors to go back on site. Are we seeing data entry errors that require training? Are the staff fully familiar with the protocol? Are they being compliant with it? What's the overall conduct of the site with regard to quality? You don't want to, you know, you're going to get nervous if you walk into a site and you see a disheveled site where the source documentation is not where it needs to be, and that may cause you to have to, again, do more monitoring. And last but not least are the study tasks being delegated appropriately by the investigator. So these are all reasons that may cause you to revert back to a more traditional type of monitoring. And last but not least is the clinical investigative site going to play ball with you when you come in and say, we've detected some issues here. Maybe it's incongruity between a certain scale and a neurology trial where they should be moving in the same direction, and our monitoring activities on that data are suggesting that they're moving in opposite directions, which is contrary to what would happen in that type of clinical setting or with that type of patient. So are they going to be compliant with what you're seeing and the changes that they may need to make to move forward effectively and efficiently, and you know, the requirements that would be in place there to get the site to move forward along with you. Okay? So bottom line here, I think, is there's still strong motivation to continue on-site monitoring, and people tend to revert to that when they see some of these things I've described start to go wrong. Now, let's see if we get a voice of reason here on the pushback. Okay?
So anyway, you know, intelligent monitoring, this is what risk-based monitoring is all about. We have to put, for the first time in this industry, put our heads together and figure out what is going to be successful from the traditional way of doing monitoring. And so, so you can use it in some cases, other cases it's going to be limited. And this next slide here, really interesting slide, this came from a 2008 study that was actually measuring protocol complexity. And with that protocol complexity, it was measuring it within the phase of a study, as well as different therapeutic areas. And of course, what it showed was that depending on your therapeutic area, depending on your phase, it was really geared towards a work burden and growth of that work burden according to what sites were reporting back. So you see here, definitely phase 1, phase 2, you see you have percentages there. Those are higher percentages in this work burden growth that is going to make you wonder, is that going to be really a true model to bring risk-based monitoring into? Then you see even phase 3 and phase 4. Now we're going into different therapeutic areas in this area here, and you can see kind of levels itself out in phase 3 and 4. So phase 3 and 4 would really look favorable to be risk-based monitoring. And so, so very interesting data that came from this particular report. One thing we have to look at with risk-based monitoring, the reality of the workforce. And this is here to stay, not going away very soon. We have an extreme CRA shortage that actually the workforce is burned out, especially those that are working out there in the field at least 5, 10 plus years. They're leaving the industry completely. We also are seeing the frequent job changes of leaving that industry, but also too what it's doing for us, it's making us change as industry and what we're doing in monitoring and monitoring practices. And so, so this is something to consider with risk-based monitoring, and this is where risk-based monitoring is going to help, where we're seeing the CRA shortages. So what does that mean? Well, maybe there needs to be a strategic partnership when you're deciding to do risk-based monitoring, particularly when we're looking at monitoring practices. We have to get away from that traditional 100% on-site monitoring and go more towards the robust monitoring. And I'll have a diagram here after this, where we're taking that monitor, they're doing more than checking boxes. They're doing more than just going out there every 4 to 6 weeks. This is where intelligent monitoring comes into play. They all come together with robust monitoring practices, even using a CRO or even clinical expertise. Definitely you need expertise in clinical operations and clinical in order to get this risk-based monitoring together. They need to know what's out there in the field as well as what's out there in the protocol itself. And then of course technology. Technology is huge. Where I showed the graph at the beginning here, that was during the years of 2000, 2007 when they took that data. We are far advanced in technology than we were then. That's why it brings risk-based monitoring so more conducive to this industry and making changes in the industry. And of course, FDA. Still have to follow FDA with risk-based monitoring. Also too, they support risk-based monitoring, but we're still going to come back to the basics, and that is subject safety, integrity of the data. That's not going away. And so something to consider overall is that risk-based monitoring, it's not one system, it's not one button you push and here you go. You have to use the intelligent approach to put things together, usually during study design, perfect time when you start developing risk-based monitoring. And then of course, concept of change and strategy. Basically what this is actually a model that we have used in a phase 3 pivotal study, but you can really use this multiple phases, multiple therapeutic areas in different ways. First of all, on the left-hand side, you see sample study start. This is at the start of a study. What you're doing is you're actually taking a percentage at the start of a study. And then what you're doing is you're taking remote monitoring, either in-house CRAs or even home-based CRAs, doing remote monitoring in this model that is actually going to give you the forefront of frequency for on-site monitoring. And same thing with the right-hand side, taking a different sample of data. You're actually taking that percentage, but on the second sample is more towards your interim phase of a study. And what you're doing is we're taking evaluable subjects, we're taking number of activated sites, but the main melting pot of this formula is the calculation tool in the middle. The calculation tool in the middle has criteria. That criteria is going to dictate, with strong remote monitoring, going to dictate this on-site frequency, then bringing in your centralized systems. Most of remote monitoring, very much effective with centralized systems. And so with this little strategy that's put here together, definitely helps with building risk-based monitoring as a program itself.